Hi there, my name's Damien. I'm a paediatric emergency medicine consultant from Leicester. I'm the immediate past chair of PERUKI. The current chair is Niall Mullin, who's a PEM consultant up in Sunderland. So I'm going to be doing a brief run through PERUKI, a bit of its background, some of the studies that we've done, where we intend to go into the future, and then some wider learning. It's been an amazingly long journey. Back in, I think, 2011, 2012, a group of clinicians got together with a view that PEM, pediatric emergency medicine, as an emerging specialty, had a lot to offer the research. And we knew at that stage, even though we were only developing a grid training program, we still felt we had a lot to offer the academic community, and we felt by being collaborative, we could achieve something that perhaps other medical specialties weren't able to achieve, which was perhaps, and dare I say it, an absence of infighting and not having disparate research or disparate research groups competing for the same money. We were really aligned at the beginning for saying, okay, let's have one network to do big studies together, and that will be as collaborative as we can. And to some extent, I think we really have achieved that vision. The Research Steering Committee started off as only 20 sites, but now extends to nearly 70. And the makeup of PERUKI is that there are individual members. Anyone can join PERUKI for free, but that each of the sites has one nominated member who sits on what's called a Research Steering Committee. Now, the Research Steering Committee doesn't really meet. It's not a regular agendaed meeting, the executive meet, but the Research Steering Committee receives study proposals. They adjudicate on those study proposals, and they make sure that studies go forward with the best clinician input, both medical and nursing, as there can be possible. And that's a really important point to make, is that a lot of PERUKI studies have had a widespread input, not of academics, not of researchers, but of clinicians who are on the shop floor, who really understand what's going to make a study work and what isn't, what's feasible and what's not. And I think that has been at the core of some of PERUKI's success. Another thing is communication. So we have this widespread network based of the sites and the individual members. We meet once a year for a kind of a PERUKI annual meeting, and we have regular email shots, including a newsletter. We hope we're relatively engaged with our membership, and we've recently, the executive have split the country up into various regions, and each of those executives meets or will start to meet regularly with each of those regions. And I recently have taken on kind of the East Midlands, East Anglia area, and we've had a small meeting already just to discuss some of the challenges that some of the sites have, how we can resolve those, what are studies coming up, and we'll have another one in early 2024. But we have been quite proud of the fact that this is a bottom-up organization. We do try and listen to the concerns and that members have, particularly around some funding issues, and we are able to take some of that concern to the highest levels within the NIHR. So a number of executive members sit on different committees. I sit on the children's CRN, and are able to feed back directly to those in the NIHR that count about some of the research difficulties that people may be experiencing. We started actually with what at the time was relatively innovative. It's not innovative anymore to set research priorities, but 10 years ago, we decided to just go out to the membership and say, okay, what are the important research topics to you? And that was published, and that has set up a framework for us to follow over the next decade. And recently, we are going to have decided to repeat that prioritization exercise, and I'll talk about that at the end. But that piece of work enables us to go to funders and say, oh, actually, this is a priority of pediatric emergency clinicians, and this is why it needs to be done. And one of the things that came out of that was, what is the best intravenous medication for acute asthma? And I'm showing this particular question because this is really a long game. So some of you will be aware that over the summer, this exact question was eventually picked up by the HTA and has been released as a call that has gone out to the first stage. And we're about to learn about the second stage and whether the PERUKI bid for that has got through. This has been a body of work that has been a long time in the making. And as on that journey, there have been little bits and pieces of research that have taken place, doing surveys and evaluations. And one of the important pieces of work, which was what is actually given to children and what do clinicians think are given in terms of infusion, salbutamol, aminophylline, etc. And what we found is from this first piece of work from 2015 that there was a tenfold variation in infusion rates of salbutamol given by different PERUKI departments. And this variation in practice, even though when we get together, we all talk about how we do the same thing, we simply don't. And we've recently done a piece of work looking at periorbital cellulitis and show that only 67% of people follow their own guidelines. So we asked clinicians what they did. They then uploaded their guidelines. And lo and behold, we found that people don't even follow the stuff that they're meant to be doing in their own department. I highlight this study because this was one of the first pieces of work from our Route to Research scheme. We're really interested in building capability. So at the time, Marielle Tolhurst-Cleaver was a trainee in Alderhay. She's now a consultant in Alderhay, but has been through the process of delivering a PERUKI study, how to submit, how to go through ethics or research governance, etc. And we've got a number of studies which have been trainee-led, and we think that's a really important part of our work. Eclipse, I think, is the landmark study that PERUKI were involved in. So this was a randomized controlled trial looking at phenytoin versus levetiracetam. And this was a study that unfortunately didn't show the difference that we would expect. In fact, levetiracetam didn't perform as well as we thought it might did, and phenytoin performed better than previous studies had suggested, which shows you the importance of doing these real-time prospective RCTs, because literally, if you go back and look at previous studies which are retrospective or have been single center, they often don't give you the results that you think they would. But this has been practice changing, because as part of this study, we have found that it probably is safe to give Keppra. So as part of the APLS mantra now, that you have a child, they're in status, they've have their second benzo. If they've not been, if they're still in status, they would then get levetiracetam, then phenytoin, while you're drawing up the process of considering doing an RSI. And there are other studies to come in the Eclipse vein, which I will come on to. Another early study that we delivered was CAPIT. So this was a placebo-controlled non-inferiority trial looking at low and high dose amoxicillin for pneumonia for short and long durations. And again, what we found was that there was very little difference between low and high and short and long. And there's some really interesting learning from this, because all of the arms were essentially the same. If you look at it, cough, which was one of the outcome measures, was present in about 25% of the participants at 3 weeks. And so I've changed my practice. I tell parents, look, if you've had a pneumonia, your cough is going to go on. And that's got nothing to do with the antibiotics that you've been given. That is just the consequence of having a lower respiratory tract infection. So that's really interesting learning. The next question then is, well, actually, do we need to be given antibiotics at all if there is no difference in duration and dose? And there is an American study that is recruiting, looking at a placebo-controlled trial for children with community-acquired pneumonia. Really looking forward to that particular result. We do have to mention, though, in this study that the bounce back rate was really high. I mean, I think about 50 to 60% of patients did seek treatment again. And you could also argue in this study that it was a clinician decision. We didn't have radiologically confirmed pneumonia. So a criticism of this study could have been that it was a milieu, and could have been lots of lower respiratory tract infections caused by virus. I would argue that that's natural clinical practice, which is what PERUKI studies try and be. And in fact, the study, which had over 800 recruits, probably was balanced enough that that should have worked its way out by chance, i.e. the ones that were viral will have been equally spread amongst 4 groups. The other interesting thing that came from CAPID is we did some study within study research, and we got the research nurses, and they'd started a monthly research nurse webinar, and this is something we've tried to adopt in all our big PERUKI studies, that the sites meet regularly. They compare and contrast, they share quick wins, they highlight barriers, and obviously, I think some of this is you could have predicted, but it was quite clear that lack of hours research staff cover is a real barrier to being able to recruit to emergency medicine studies. And then there's a whole load of other things, some of which you can actually address. So lack of GCP trained doctors, that is something within a site's gift to be able to solve. And then having everyone trained in the recruitment process, having recruitment packs, these are all key successes. So this is a learning that can be shared amongst sites, and that's something we take from study to study. So we're not just learning about a particular kind of study question, we're learning about the nature of delivering PEM research. Another recent study, so this was one of the few studies that kept going throughout the COVID pandemic. It's testament to the staff on the ground to be able to do that, but this was FORCE. This was looking at buccal fractures. So this is a very simple fracture of the wrist in children, and Mr. Dan Perry, or now Professor Dan Perry, should I say, has really revolutionized orthopedic work, and he's taken it by the scruff of the neck, and he said, we just need to crack on with these families. So in the FORCE study, what he did with his PPI group is he said he thought there wasn't going to need to be any treatment at all. PPI group said, well, it's going to be difficult to recruit parents to nothing. So it was essentially a study of traditional treatment, which is a buccal splint, like a cast, a numb plaster cast, but something to hold your wrist steady, and then a bandage. Now, wrapping a bandage around the wrist is not going to make any difference, but at least the parents thought something was going to be done. And in the FORCE study, what we found was there was no difference at pain at 3 days. So in our department now, we see a child with a buccal fracture, and we simply say, look, you just take good pain relief for the next 3 days. You don't need to come back to fracture clinic, and literally you can be on your way. And we've been doing that for a year now, and we've had no problems whatsoever. So this is a real practice change. Now, this is a more significant fracture. You've essentially got an off-ended to your radius here. How would you treat this? Well, most people would say, well, you've got to have some treatment, you've got to have a manipulation, you've got to have maybe go to theatre, etc. But actually, for this particular patient, you'll find that things always model up. So centuries ago, we didn't have treatments, and not everyone died because of their arm fracture. The body is amazingly good when you are young at remodeling. And this is a sequence of events, again, to show that you can just put a plaster cast on. You don't even need to tweak it, and it will remodel. This is from Hawaii, and there was basically in Hawaii, they ran out of the ability to do procedural sedation. So for a period of time, all they could do was put plaster casts on, and this series from Hawaii demonstrated that we're probably doing too much. So the CRAFT study running at the moment is literally randomizing people to an intervention or no intervention for this group. That study will report sometime next year, year after. And again, what a practice-changing study this will be. People would not believe at the moment you could just leave these fractures alone. And there's still a lot of angry orthopedic surgeons saying that this isn't going to work, but let's see what the study showed. The other thing that PERUKI have been involved in is TARN, so TARN, the Trauma Audit and Research Network, and we've done a series of work looking at adolescent trauma. So we've had 3 papers out now which have examined the incidence of adolescent trauma, outcomes. Are adolescent groups different from children? Are they different from adults? Some interesting findings which differ from the American experience, showing that if you're an adolescent and you go to a pediatric specific unit, your outcomes may be better than just a mixed trauma center. And so there is some interesting findings from that. We've also done some work on looking at change in practice of CT scanning. So we've recently shown that when the RCR changed their guidance to say that you didn't need to do whole body scans for children with trauma who didn't have a kind of obvious serious injury, unfortunately, practice hasn't changed in the way we'd like, and people still want to do these whole body CTs, which are probably unnecessary in this age group. And then as an example of some of the international work we do, we took a case example, so a baby, 3 days of upper respiratory tract infection, worsening cough, 48 hours of increased breathing with no risk factors, and we gave some clinical parameters, but we did give a temperature of 38.1, and we asked a UK audience and a Canadian audience what they would do, and the LP rate was staggeringly different. People doing bloods and urines staggeringly different from the United Kingdom. And this begs a lot of questions about the management of bronchiolitis. And if you're going to do studies internationally, can you say that UK and Canada are the same? Because the risk assessment, the clinical risk that doctors will do is widely different. And so that does interest me as a health policy kind of researcher about, okay, if we've derived some research from North America versus Australia versus the UK, how applicable is it to widespread translation? And then this is just an other example of how that is in practice. So this was published in the Lancet. So this is pharmacotherapy for children with diagnosed bronchiolitis at discharge from the emergency department, comparing PERUKI, so the UK, then there's PREDICT, which is Australia and New Zealand, PECARN, which is in the USA. And again, massive difference in patients discharged with some form of pharmacotherapy compared to the UK and Australia. So there's a lot of food for thought there. One of our most recent studies, and this is a study that I've been chief investigator of, is we knew at the end of the first COVID wave that the Australians had been given an absolute beating with this out of season bronchiolitis wave. And we had an opportunity to study this in real time. So we've recruited over 60 sites. And what we were able to do is demonstrate that actually bronchiolitis itself didn't change. So it was still more severe and serious in the younger age groups. Rates of ICU admission were about the same. There were more children per capita in this 1 to 2 year old group, and that's what we'd expected, because this whole generation of 0 to 1 year olds in 2020 had missed bronchiolitis completely. So they all caught it in 2021, which is why things were so busy. But actually, the clinical presentation of bronchiolitis didn't really change. The other thing that PERUKI have become really expertise at is utilizing survey tools, in this case, REDCap, and being able to split the information required for prospective studies. So we also did this for the PIC study, which was petechiae in children. And what we did is we had children present, they get recruited, the clinician puts in only the information that you can't get in the notes, so it's a small amount, and then someone can go back at a later stage and fill in the information that is all obtainable from the notes. And that gets clinician engagement because they're not having to do much in real time when they're busy, but we collect the information that we really need. And that's been a very successful way of delivering studies. And in PERUKI, this website isn't working quite at the moment, but we were able to demonstrate our results in real time. The other exciting thing that is literally hot off the press is that the JCVI, the group that deals on vaccinations, and making the decision to decide that we will have nirsevimab next year. So this is a monoclonal antibody against RSV. They cited the BronchStart study as evidence of why they made that decision, because there was such a need to deliver against this winter virus, which just wreaks havoc every winter. So what have we got going at the moment? So there's so many other studies to speak about. Where I've put brackets NIHR, that's studies that have NIHR funding attached to them or being applied for. So the Curly study is looking at lengths of antibiotic treatment for children with UTIs, which have had a systemic response. And that's going to be over 3, 6, 9, or 12 days, I think. Urine collection, so this is a study requested by the NIHR to look at whether it would be feasible to do a study looking at catheter in-outs urines versus other traditional collections such as clean catch. NEO is a study looking at the way we assess neonates at triage and whether there should be specific triage rules for infants less than 6 weeks of age. TWIST is a study looking at toddlers' fractures. So we all treat toddlers' fractures in different ways. Can we come up with a standardized doing way of that? FIDO and FIDO-QOL. So this is the management basically of a febrile infant less than 3 months. The Americans have done some huge work now on creating algorithms, and this is the UK version. So we have completed a study over the last 18 months, collected above time and target, I think over 1,000 infants with fever and less than 3 months of age to check our algorithms and whether PCT has real value in this age group. EASY is a urine study for less than 3 months old, and can we treat these infants with oral antibiotics rather than admitting them for IV therapy? AVITA is the asthma study I was talking about at the beginning. So we are submitting a study to compare IV magnesium sulfate, IV salbutamol, and IV aminophylline head-to-head. Basically, we'll hear about that in 2024. Really exciting, large RCT. And then PRECISE is an interesting study led by Tom Waterfield in Belfast, looking at children who present with asthma and are RSV positive about whether these children who present with viral wheeze, whether it's worth treating them or not, if you know that they do have a positive respiratory virus PCR. And as I mentioned at the beginning, working with RChem and the James Lind Alliance, we're going to repeat our prioritization work to work out what are the major topics that we need to take on board over the next couple of years. Finally, just to finish it with, what are our strengths? What are the things that PERUKI do well? We have innate enthusiasm. We've got organizational memory. We know what works. We know what doesn't. And we think we're clinically led. Yes, we're academically nuanced. We have kind of researchers who are under a university auspice on the executive and as part of the group. But actually, what we are mainly is clinicians wanting to do the best for children and young people. We do have problems. There are our kryptonites. Funding is a perpetual issue. And what we're working with is trying to submit a small amount of PERUKI in every grant we do so we can build up a budget so it makes it easier for us not to have to link with APAM, for example. APAM, the Association of Paediatric Emergency Medicine, have been hugely generous at giving us money to be able to do meetings and keep ticking over. But we'd like to become self-sustaining. And yes, I know we have an organizational memory, but recording our learning to make sure that it's written down, we've not been so good at. So one of our plans for 2024 is get a series of publications that describe the PERUKI way. But this is my favorite quote. It comes from someone who is now a PERUKI member and a PERUKI site. But they came to us. They saw that we were just cracking on with doing research study, and if others could do it, they could do it too. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but if there are questions that I need to answer, I'll be happy to do that via email. Cheers.